It was supposed to be just another Easter lunch, the kind where the scent of roasted lamb and cinnamon pies clings to your clothes for hours afterward. But as I sat at the long mahogany table in my in-laws' dining room, clutching my glass of water a little too tightly, I heard something that made my stomach turn to ice. My name is Emily Carter, and in that moment, I became invisible, or so my husband's sister thought. Through the murmur of conversation, I caught her voice, low but sharp enough to slice through the air. "She's not even family. She never will be." The words struck with such precision, it felt like they had been rehearsed. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My eyes stayed fixed on the pale pink glaze of my plate, but inside me, something cracked open, a soundless, brittle fracture. Sarah, my husband's sister, sat 2 seats down, sipping her wine with the composure of someone who had just dropped a grenade and was waiting for the smoke. I had learned early on that she was the kind of woman who could ruin you without ever raising her voice. Her smile was soft, but her heart was sharpened steel. James, my husband, was mid-conversation with his uncle, oblivious. He had no idea that in a single, quiet sentence, his sister had planted a seed of humiliation in my chest. I glanced around the table. The silver serving dishes gleamed. The laughter bounced off the cream-painted walls, and yet I felt like I was locked inside a glass box, pounding on the walls for someone to see me. No one did. I tried to tell myself it was just a careless remark, that maybe I had misunderstood, but I couldn't erase the calculated precision in Sarah's tone. I had been married into this family for 4 years, 4 Easters, 4 Christmases, countless birthdays, anniversaries, and hospital visits. I had cooked meals, sent cards, held their hands during funerals, and yet, apparently, I wasn't family. The injustice of it pressed against my ribs like a weight. I thought of all the times I had brushed off her subtle digs, convincing myself they were harmless. But there was nothing harmless about this. Her words didn't just sting. They unstitched something I had carefully mended over years. In that moment, something in me shifted. I decided that silence was no longer an act of grace. It was complicity. And if Sarah wanted to remind me I was an outsider, then perhaps it was time she learned what it felt like to have the floor drop out from under her. The rest of Easter lunch unfolded like a slow-motion scene from a play I no longer wanted to star in. I watched Sarah, her delicate fingers gliding over the stem of her wineglass, her lips curving into that soft, practiced smile she used on strangers and enemies alike. She was beautiful in a way that made people underestimate her. Honey blonde hair, eyes the color of sea glass, and a voice that could sell you salvation or damnation, depending on her mood. I knew her well enough to tell she was enjoying herself. She believed I would stay quiet, that my silence was her shield. I forced myself to breathe evenly, nodding politely at James's uncle as he asked about my new work project. My words came automatically, but my mind was fixed on Sarah's remark, replaying it over and over until it became a drumbeat in my head. Every time she laughed or leaned toward someone to whisper, my skin prickled. It wasn't the first time she had tried to undermine me, but this was different. This time she had done it in public, in front of the people whose opinions shaped the family's hierarchy. James remained oblivious, his hand occasionally resting on mine in those small, absent gestures that say, "I'm here," without really being here at all. If he had heard his sister's words, he gave no sign, and that hurt almost as much as the comment itself. The idea that even if he had noticed, he might have dismissed it as just Sarah being Sarah. I found myself studying the other faces at the table. Did his mother, Evelyn, hear it? She was slicing her lamb with delicate precision, her pearl necklace resting perfectly against her collarbone, but her eyes flickered once toward Sarah with something I couldn't quite read. Evelyn was a master of emotional concealment. She could know your deepest secret and still offer you tea without a tremor in her hand. If she had heard it, she wasn't going to intervene. Not yet. Somewhere between the dessert arriving and the coffee being poured, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Sarah with anger. She would expect that, feed off it. No, I was going to wait. I was going to choose my words with the same precision she had used to wound me. And when the time came, she wouldn't just regret what she'd said. She would wish she had never underestimated me at all. But to strike properly, I needed ammunition. And as fate would have it, Sarah had already given me the perfect one. She just didn't know I knew about it yet. After dessert, the conversation drifted into the usual Easter small talk, vacation plans, the new neighbor with the ostentatious sports car, and Evelyn's annual complaint about the rising price of flowers. I let my fork trace idle patterns on my plate, my face arranged into that polite, neutral expression I had perfected over the years. But inside, my mind was already building a map, a route from this very table to the truth I was about to deliver. Sarah was animated, her voice light as she shared a story about a friend who had recently gotten engaged in Paris. Her words were carefully framed, but I caught the small, telling smile at the corner of her lips. That wasn't just a friend, that was him. I knew because I had seen them together, in a place she never imagined I'd be. And the man she was describing, charming, wealthy, infatuated, wasn't the man her husband thought she was having dinner with during those late work nights. I sipped my coffee slowly, hiding my satisfaction behind the porcelain cup. There's a dangerous power in knowing something no one else does. It's like holding a match in a room full of dry kindling. Sarah thought I was passive, thought I'd swallow her insult and let it rot inside me. But she had handed me the match months ago, and tonight I was beginning to feel the heat in my palm. James leaned toward me at one point, brushing his lips against my temple in a small, affectionate gesture and whispered, "You okay?" "You've gone quiet." I smiled and told him I was fine, because I was. More than fine. I had moved from wounded to focused, from passive to calculating. My silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Evelyn watched me from across the table, her gaze lingering for just a fraction longer than usual. She was too clever not to notice the subtle shift in the air. Maybe she sensed what was coming, or maybe she just saw that I was no longer the same woman who had walked into this dining room an hour ago. Either way, I didn't care. What mattered was timing. By the time the conversation circled back to family traditions, I already knew exactly how I would deliver the blow. It wouldn't be a scene. It would be a revelation so quiet, so deliberate, that when it landed, the silence afterward would be deafening. I leaned back in my chair, letting the laughter around the table wash over me like static. Everyone seemed blissfully unaware that each question I asked, each comment I made, was carefully chosen. I had always been the listener in this family, the one who absorbed more than I revealed. That night, I weaponized that role. My voice remained light, my words harmless on the surface, but beneath them, I was sewing threads that would later pull everything apart. At one point, I turned to Sarah and said, "That Paris engagement story, it's beautiful. Was it recent?" Her eyes flickered, a tiny flash of panic she covered with a sip of wine. "Oh, a couple of months ago," she said, glancing away as though searching for an escape hatch in the wallpaper. I stored that hesitation in the vault of my mind, alongside every other inconsistency she had given me. James, oblivious to the undercurrent, launched into a story from our early dating days. His voice was warm, and it softened the edge of my thoughts. But even as I smiled at his recollection, my mind was elsewhere, recalling the way Sarah's hand had lingered on the arm of the man I'd seen her with, the way her laugh had been softer, more intimate, than it ever was at family gatherings. She had looked at him the way I once looked at James, before his sister decided I was never truly one of them. Evelyn interrupted James to ask me about work, her tone almost too casual. I answered smoothly, though I caught her eyes scanning me like she was trying to read a hidden message on my skin. Evelyn didn't trust me. She never had. But that night, I sensed something else. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe she suspected I knew more than I was letting on. If she only knew how much. The wine glasses were refilled, the plates cleared, and someone suggested moving into the sitting room for coffee and chocolates. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before agreeing, because I knew that what was coming needed the intimacy of couches and low lamplight. The dining table was too rigid, too formal. The living room, however, would allow the illusion of comfort before I stripped it away. As we stood, Sarah brushed past me and murmured just loud enough for me to hear, "Still trying to prove you belong?" I didn't flinch, didn't even look at her. That was the beauty of patience, letting someone think they were winning until the moment they realized the board had been set against them from the start. What she didn't know was that by moving to the living room, I was moving her closer to her own undoing. I wasn't just biding my time anymore. I was setting the stage, piece by piece, for the moment when every mask in this room would shatter. The living room felt smaller than I remembered, the air denser, as if the walls themselves sensed what was coming. The sofas were arranged in a semicircle, pulling everyone into a kind of unspoken intimacy. I chose the armchair by the fireplace, not the most comfortable seat, but the one that gave me the clearest view of every face in the room. From here, I could watch every shift in posture, every glance exchanged, every tiny tell. Sarah sat directly opposite me, framed between James and her fiancé, Daniel. Perfect. I let the first few minutes pass in idle chatter. The conversation drifted from Easter traditions to travel, each topic floating like a balloon in the air. I waited for the right moment, sipping my coffee as though I were just another guest enjoying the warmth of family. Then, with a casual tone, I asked, "So, Sarah, you mentioned Paris earlier. Did you go there for work or pleasure?" The question was dressed in harmless curiosity, but I already knew the answer wouldn't fit neatly into either category. She smiled, too quickly, and said, "Oh, pleasure, of course. Daniel and I needed a little getaway." Her words were polished, rehearsed, but her eyes betrayed her. She glanced at Daniel, who nodded along a beat too late, as if he'd been elsewhere in his thoughts. That delay was small, invisible to most, but to me it was the sound of a loose thread being tugged. My fingers itched to pull harder. The conversation veered toward vacation recommendations, and I let others talk for a while. But I circled back, gently, as if by accident. "Paris in winter must be magical. Did you get to see the Christmas markets?" Sarah blinked, her lips parting just slightly. Yes, we did," she said, brushing an imaginary hair from her cheek. But she forgot to account for her own timeline. She'd claimed the trip was only a couple of months ago, and Easter was already here in spring. Another crack in the porcelain. Evelyn, seated at the far end of the couch, leaned forward as if to get a better look at Sarah. I caught her eye for a moment, and I saw it. That flicker of suspicion. It wasn't aimed at me this time. It was aimed at her own daughter. Evelyn had been a master of family appearances for decades. If she noticed something was off, she'd bury it for the sake of reputation. Unless, of course, someone else gave her no choice but to acknowledge it. I almost smiled. James, oblivious to the shift in energy, launched into a funny story about a cooking disaster we'd had last year. The room laughed, but it felt brittle, the kind of laughter people use to cover discomfort. My gaze stayed locked on Sarah, and I could see her shoulders tightening with every minute that passed. She was trying to play it cool, but something in her demeanor told me she was already thinking 3 steps ahead, wondering how much I knew, wondering if tonight would stay safe for her. It wouldn't, not if I had anything to say about it, because the truth about Sarah's Paris trip wasn't going to stay buried much longer. I didn't need to force it out of her. All I had to do was let her unravel herself in front of the people she most wanted to impress. And from the look in her eyes, I could tell that process had already begun. Dinner plates were cleared away, and Evelyn insisted on bringing out her famous lemon meringue pie, the one Sarah had always claimed was her favorite. The family shifted back into the living room with their dessert plates, settling into a softer, post-meal rhythm. It was the perfect environment for me to begin my next move. Not too formal, not too chaotic. Just enough comfort to make people careless. I stayed in my armchair, fork in hand, letting the tart sweetness of the pie mask the sharper taste of my thoughts. I started with a warm smile and a tone of nostalgia. "Do you all remember that trip to the coast we took years ago? The one where James nearly lost the car keys in the sand?" Laughter bubbled around the room. Genuine this time. Even Sarah smiled, her guard lowering as she took a bite of pie. I leaned into the memory, painting vivid pictures of that summer. The heat, the smell of salt, the way Evelyn had worn a wide-brimmed hat that made her look like a movie star from the 50s. It was harmless, safe, disarming. Then I slid the first hook in. You know, that was the same summer Sarah disappeared for an entire afternoon and came back sunburned and grinning. "You said you'd met some locals, right, Sarah?" I asked lightly, as though it were nothing more than a funny anecdote, but I kept my eyes fixed on her face. She blinked twice before answering. "Oh, yes, I remember. Just some teenagers I hung out with." Her voice was steady enough, but the subtle shift in her breathing told a different story. Daniel chuckled awkwardly. "You were always so social," he said, trying to smooth over the moment. I gave him a polite nod, but I didn't let go. "Funny thing, though," I continued, "you've always had a knack for keeping certain adventures to yourself, like your Paris trip. I bet there were some locals there too, I said it with a playful lilt, but I saw the quick clench of her jaw, the way she set down her fork a little too carefully. A microsecond of tension, but tension all the same. Evelyn's gaze drifted from me to Sarah, and I could see the matriarch's mind clicking into gear. She wasn't sure yet what I was aiming for, but she could sense that I was guiding the current of conversation toward something more dangerous. And if Evelyn suspected there was rot beneath the surface, she'd eventually want to know exactly where it was hiding. I made sure to keep my own expression unreadable, as though this was just another round of family chatter. "James," still blissfully unaware of the silent war brewing between his wife and sister, launched into another light-hearted story. I let him take the reins for a bit, all the while studying Sarah. She tried to laugh along, but her body language betrayed her, leaning slightly away from Daniel, fiddling with the hem of her sleeve, stealing glances at the clock. She was trapped between the warmth of the family setting and the growing unease that I wasn't going to let her off the hook. By the time the coffee cups were being refilled, I knew I'd accomplished exactly what I set out to do. Sarah's composure wasn't shattered, not yet, but the cracks were visible. And once cracks appear, it's only a matter of time before the whole facade falls apart. I just needed the right moment to pull, and that moment was closer than she realized. After coffee, I suggested we look through some old family photo albums that Evelyn had stacked on the side table. Everyone groaned playfully at the nostalgia, but I could see Sarah stiffen as I lifted the first leather-bound volume. "Remember this Easter?" I said casually, opening to a page where James and I were barely 10, covered in chocolate and giggles. Everyone laughed, pointing out forgotten hairstyles and awkward poses, but beneath the laughter, I felt the tension coil tighter around Sarah. I leafed through more pages, letting my fingers linger on photos that showed candid moments, beach trips, birthdays, graduations. I commented lightly on each, guiding the conversation, planting seeds of curiosity and subtle unease. "Oh, this one," I said, pointing to a picture of Sarah near the coast. "You look different, almost like you were with someone else." My voice was casual, teasing even, but I caught the twitch in her lips. She froze, pretending to adjust her hair, but her eyes betrayed the flicker of panic. Daniel, still trying to blend in, chuckled nervously. "I think she's always been adventurous," he said, casting a glance at Sarah. But Sarah's hand clenched the edge of the photo album just slightly, enough for me to notice. Her carefully curated image of herself was slipping, and she didn't even know I was the one watching. I smiled quietly to myself, because sometimes the smallest details, a hand, a blink, a pause, tell more truth than 1,000 words. Evelyn leaned forward, squinting at a picture from last summer. "Sarah, you look familiar here. Who was that with you?" Her voice was soft, almost conversational, but the look in her eyes was sharp. Sarah's throat tightened. Her laughter caught somewhere between artificial and brittle. She gave a vague answer about friends from work, but the hesitation was clear, and the room, despite the casual surface chatter, felt suddenly heavy. I held my expression carefully neutral, sipping my coffee as if I weren't orchestrating the entire tension in the room. "Friends are fun," I said lightly, "but some of us have short memories, and some of us like to remember the details." My words were innocent enough to pass as commentary, but I felt the weight of them land. Sarah shifted in her seat, realizing she might not have full control of the narrative this time. James, still oblivious, leaned closer and pointed at a graduation photo. "Look how small we were. And you, Sarah, always posing like a model." I nodded, allowing a compliment to ease the moment. Compliments are the perfect bait. They lower defenses just enough so the truth can slip through. I watched Sarah relax slightly, unaware that each step of my casual questioning had been guiding her into a corner, where contradictions would reveal themselves naturally. By the time I closed the photo album, I knew the first layer of the trap was set. Sarah's composure was cracked, but she hadn't fallen yet. She was watching me, guessing perhaps, sensing that I knew more than I was saying. And that's when I smiled softly inside, knowing the moment of revelation, the one that would leave everyone speechless, was coming. All I had to do was wait for the right turn in conversation. The evening had taken on a different rhythm, one where laughter felt lighter, smiles a little too forced, and silence carried weight. I let my fork rest on my plate and watched Sarah fidget with her napkin, her composure straining at the seams. It was time to begin planting the next seed, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her rethink every carefully curated word she had shared so far. The room still thought this was casual family dinner conversation, but for me, it was chess, each move deliberate. "Speaking of summer trips," I began, voice calm, almost dreamy. "It's funny how some people always seem to know where others are going. Sometimes it's coincidence. Sometimes it's a little more deliberate." I let the words hang in the air, their ambiguity a dagger wrapped in silk. Sarah's fork paused midair, her eyes flicking toward mine, trying to read intent. She had the faintest color drain from her cheeks, a tell I stored in my memory like evidence. Daniel tried to bridge the tension. You mean like planning surprise visits? He asked, smiling nervously. I nodded, slow and casual. Exactly. Or maybe noticing things that aren't meant to be noticed. My eyes lingered on Sarah, and I saw her swallow, stiffening imperceptibly. That was the sound of guilt trying to disguise itself as calm. I wasn't rushing her. I let the anxiety simmer, knowing it would deepen with each minute she remained unprepared. Evelyn chimed in, curiosity finally overtaking politeness. Sarah, you were always mysterious with your friends, she said, her tone neutral but probing. You never shared much about who you spent time with, I added softly, almost as if musing aloud. Funny how some people are just too busy making sure no one notices everything they do. The words weren't accusations, but they carried a weight Sarah couldn't ignore. She shifted, one leg crossed tightly over the other, trying to appear relaxed while every muscle screamed alert. I allowed a small pause, letting the tension thicken. Sometimes, I said, lifting my coffee cup slowly, people have relationships that are hidden from even the closest eyes. And sometimes, those relationships can be the very thing that explains a lot of secrets. I tilted my head as if in contemplation, casual and harmless. Sarah's hands trembled slightly on her plate, and she caught herself before spilling anything. My inner satisfaction surged. The first cracks of her facade were visible. James, still oblivious, chuckled and recounted a story from his college days. I let him speak, my eyes never leaving Sarah. The casual interruption allowed her to gather herself, but it also forced her to pretend composure in front of everyone. I sipped my coffee, imagining the reveal in slow motion, knowing that each carefully chosen word I had spoken now made the truth closer to exposure. Every observer in the room felt the tension, even if they couldn't name it. By the time dessert was cleared, Sarah was taut, her smiles brief, her glances darting between Daniel, Evelyn, and me. She didn't know it yet, but the invisible noose had tightened. I hadn't said a single direct accusation, but the suggestion alone had begun to unravel her. And I knew, with the patience of a predator, that the moment when the entire family would witness her secret was imminent. After the dishes were cleared, I suggested we move to the living room to relax with some wine. Everyone agreed, though the energy had shifted. The laughter was quieter, the movements more careful. I carried the bottle and glasses to the coffee table, and as I poured, I let my eyes linger on Sarah. She was fidgeting, pretending to sip from her glass while her mind raced. I didn't need to speak yet. The suspense had already begun to do the work for me. I picked up the small stack of envelopes I had kept tucked away earlier. Receipts, notes, a few printed messages from an email thread I'd stumbled across weeks ago. I held them casually, flipping one open as if I were reviewing an unrelated matter. Funny how little things reveal a lot, I said lightly, not looking at anyone in particular. Sarah froze mid-sip, her eyes flicking toward the documents. The subtle tremor in her hands was all I needed. Remember, Sarah, I continued, my tone gentle but deliberate. Some of the trips you took weren't just about fun. Sometimes they were about meetings that weren't on the family calendar. I glanced at the envelope in my hand, as if it were evidence from a mundane errand, though everyone in the room began to sense that the air had shifted. Even Daniel's smile faltered. He was sensing the impending storm before it fully erupted. Evelyn, usually the unflappable matriarch, leaned forward instinctively. What do you mean? She asked, her voice calm but tinged with concern. I smiled softly, keeping my tone neutral. Oh, nothing too serious. Just reminders of how little details can accumulate into, well, patterns. I let the words linger, and Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. Her breath hitched slightly, betraying the calm she tried to maintain. I held up a receipt from a hotel in Paris, nonchalantly mentioning, "Funny, this place shows up twice in the last year. Daniel didn't mention it, did he?" I watched Sarah blanch, her smile forced. The room seemed to shrink, every eye on her, though no one fully understood why. The web of casual conversation and subtle evidence had begun to tighten around her. She shifted in her seat, suddenly aware that the truth she'd hidden for months might not stay buried much longer. Sarah tried to regain control. I can explain, she began, her voice wavering despite the careful effort to appear composed. It's not what it looks like. I tilted my head slightly, letting the comment hang in the air. Of course it isn't, I said softly, my tone almost conspiratorial. But when enough coincidences pile up, even the best explanations start to feel thin. Her eyes darted toward Daniel, then back at me, panic flickering in their depths. By the time I set the envelopes down on the table, The tension was nearly unbearable. Every person in the room could sense the undercurrent, even if they didn't know the full story. Sarah's defenses were cracking, but she still didn't know the extent of what I had in hand. And that's exactly how I wanted it. The family unaware of the full truth, Sarah aware of the walls closing in, and me, quietly waiting for the moment when everything would explode. The wine glasses clinked lightly as conversation meandered toward safer topics, but I could feel the pulse of tension threading through the room. I let a pause stretch long enough for everyone to grow slightly uncomfortable, their attention shifting to me. "You know," I began softly, leaning back in my chair, "sometimes people think the things they do in private never come to light. But life has a way of collecting evidence, doesn't it?" My words were gentle, almost conversational, but they landed like pebbles thrown into a still pond, sending ripples through Sarah's carefully maintained calm. Sarah's fork paused mid-air, the movement imperceptible to everyone else but clear to me. She tried to smile, to redirect the conversation, but the slight tremor in her fingers betrayed her anxiety. Evelyn furrowed her brow, sensing the tension and trying to piece together the undercurrent, while Daniel glanced at Sarah, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. I let the moment hang, the silence pressing, as if the room itself was holding its breath in anticipation. I reached for a framed photograph on the mantel, casually pointing to a corner of the image. "Funny," I said softly, "how sometimes people appear in pictures you never expected. You see, a few faces show up repeatedly in the background of events, little coincidences you might forget." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, a flash of recognition and fear surfacing. She realized immediately that I wasn't talking in generalities. She knew the truth I had in mind, though the rest of the family remained blissfully unaware. Daniel, trying to lighten the moment, laughed nervously. "You've always been good at finding details, Emily," he said. I nodded politely, allowing the compliment to mask my intentions. "I do notice," I said softly, letting my gaze linger on Sarah, "especially when something doesn't quite match the story someone is telling." Her breath caught. She shifted in her chair, leaning slightly away as the first thread of panic began to unravel her composure. Evelyn tilted her head, curiosity piqued. "Emily, what are you implying?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying a note of concern. I smiled faintly, speaking as if discussing a trivial observation. "Oh, nothing really. Just that sometimes the truth shows itself in subtle ways, little patterns that everyone notices, even if they don't talk about them." My words were careful, precise, enough to unsettle Sarah without alerting the rest of the family to the full scope of the trap I was setting. Sarah finally spoke, her voice a whisper, but loud enough for me to hear. "Emily, what are you trying to do?" Her eyes flicked toward the envelopes I had set on the table earlier, a silent acknowledgement that she feared I was about to expose everything. I tilted my head, smiling softly. "Nothing," I said lightly. "Just sharing observations. You know, the kind of details that make people rethink stories they've told over the years." I let the comment drift like smoke, subtle yet suffocating. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, Sarah's composure had visibly frayed. Her polite smiles were strained, her laughter forced, and the air around her seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension. The family, still unaware of what was brewing, sensed only a subtle shift in energy, but I knew the truth was closer than ever to coming out. The first cracks had formed, and it was only a matter of time before the walls she had built around her secret began to crumble completely. The moment felt fragile, as though the room itself was suspended in anticipation. I reached casually for the envelope I had placed on the coffee table earlier, letting the paper rustle audibly as I lifted it. "You know," I said lightly, "sometimes even the smallest details can reveal the biggest secrets." My words floated in the room, innocuous to anyone else, but Sarah's face tightened instantly, a subtle wince betraying the storm brewing behind her eyes. I slid the first document across the table, letting it rest between us like a casual offering. "I thought it might be interesting for everyone to see the patterns in our family events," I said softly. It was a printed message thread, clearly showing Sarah and a man, Daniel's colleague, meeting discreetly over several weeks. The room remained quiet as I let the evidence speak for itself, every glance, every word calculated. Sarah's hands flew to cover her mouth, panic flickering across her features. Daniel, puzzled, leaned forward. "Wait, what is this?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I tilted the papers toward him gently, keeping my tone calm. "Just Some notes and messages I came across. They explain why certain trips were taken, why some weekends seemed particularly busy for Sarah. My words were deliberate, but measured, letting the tension build naturally. Sarah's eyes darted between the envelope and my face, realizing her carefully curated narrative was crumbling. Evelyn, ever the observer, furrowed her brow. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. I nodded subtly, letting the truth hang in the air. "The evidence is right here. Patterns, locations, consistent meetings. Sometimes the things people hide in plain sight tell the clearest story." Sarah's composure snapped, and she recoiled slightly, realizing that the room, and the people she had counted on for discretion, was now fully aware, even if they didn't yet understand the details. Sarah tried to regain control, her voice trembling. I can explain," she stammered, shifting in her seat, clutching her wine glass like a lifeline. I leaned forward casually, my tone soft but firm. "Of course you can, Sarah. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable story. But look closely. Patterns don't lie. Messages, trips, excuses, all align in ways even the best storytellers can't control." My gaze locked with hers, unwavering, letting her panic silently escalate. Daniel finally connected the dots, his expression a mixture of shock and confusion. "Wait, so she's been seeing someone? Behind our backs?" His voice was incredulous, but even he hadn't anticipated the full depth of the situation. I kept my expression calm, letting the reactions unfold naturally. Every detail Sarah had tried to conceal was now exposed, and the family's collective awareness began to shift from casual dinner conversation to stunned disbelief. By the time the initial shock settled into murmurs and whispered questions, Sarah sat frozen, her mask of composure shattered. She had been exposed, yet the full emotional weight of the reveal was only beginning to sink in. The room pulsed with tension, eyes darting from one face to another, everyone trying to process what had just been revealed. And I, Emily, watched quietly, knowing that the pivotal moment, when truths collide and the aftermath becomes irreversible, was finally here. The room had turned electric, a quiet storm threatening to explode at any second. Sarah's hands shook uncontrollably as she stared at the envelope on the table, her mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't completely destroy her credibility. The wine glass rattled slightly in her grip, and I could see the layers of fear, shame, and desperation fighting for dominance in her expression. The calm she had maintained for so long was gone, replaced by raw vulnerability. For years she had controlled her image. Now she had nothing. I didn't mean for anyone to find out like this," she whispered, voice quivering, almost pleading. Daniel's eyes were wide with disbelief, his jaw tightening as he struggled to process the evidence. "Sarah, why?" he asked, voice low but edged with betrayal. I watched her falter, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling, revealing a woman caught between guilt and panic. Every syllable she uttered chipped away at the facade she had maintained, leaving nothing but the bare truth exposed for the family to witness. Evelyn leaned forward, hands clasped tightly on the table. "Sarah, we've always tried to understand you, to support you," she said, voice stern but compassionate. "Why keep this a secret? Why deceive those closest to you?" The question hung heavy in the room, and Sarah's shoulders sagged, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Her mask of composure shattered completely, and I could see that the fear she had carried for months had been heavier than any of us could imagine. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," Sarah admitted, her voice breaking. "I thought I could manage it alone, that if no one knew, it wouldn't change anything. But I see now, it changes everything. I've lied, I've hidden, and I see how wrong I was." The weight of her confession settled over the room like a heavy fog. Daniel looked stricken, his eyes darting between her and the papers in front of us. Even Evelyn, ever the mediator, couldn't mask the shock that rippled through her expression. I stayed silent for a moment, letting the confession breathe, letting the family absorb the magnitude of the truth. Sarah's lover was no longer just a secret. He was a presence in our collective reality, a disruption of the carefully maintained order of our family. I could see Daniel's confusion, Evelyn's shock, and the silent calculations running through each person's mind. The air was thick, electric, charged with emotions ranging from betrayal to disbelief, to the strange flicker of curiosity. Finally, I spoke, voice calm but steady, slicing through the tension. "Sarah, Hiding the truth may have seemed easier at first, but the longer it remained a secret, the more it controlled you. We didn't know the full story, but now we do. And that means choices have consequences, both yours and ours. The words weren't cruel, they were measured, a mirror reflecting back the impact of her actions. Her face paled further, realizing that what she had feared most, exposure, had arrived in full force. Sarah buried her face in her hands, shaking softly, the weight of shame crushing her. The room remained silent for a moment, the family grappling with shock, betrayal, and the fragile realization that the foundations of trust had been shaken. Yet amidst the chaos, there was also clarity. The truth, once hidden, could no longer be ignored, and the next steps, however painful, had to be faced. And as I watched her, Emily, I knew the final confrontation, the ultimate revelation that would leave no one untouched, was approaching. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point, a storm waiting for the first spark to ignite it. I stood slowly, letting my presence fill the space without a word. Sarah's eyes followed me, wide and panicked, as if trying to anticipate my next move. Daniel leaned forward, sensing something significant was about to happen, while Evelyn's expression teetered between worry and anticipation. The family didn't know it yet, but the moment of full revelation had arrived. "I think it's time everyone knows exactly what's been going on," I said softly, setting the envelopes in front of me on the coffee table. My voice was calm, deliberate, carrying a weight that made the room fall silent. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, realizing the moment she had dreaded was unavoidable. The papers contained messages, receipts, and photographs, the concrete proof of her relationship with Daniel's colleague, moments she had tried desperately to conceal. I began to speak slowly, letting each detail land. Sarah has been seeing someone for months, someone she promised she would keep private. Trips, late-night meetings, messages that were hidden, all of it paints a clear picture. This wasn't just an innocent friendship or casual acquaintance. It was a relationship she intentionally concealed from all of you. My gaze lingered on her, watching as the color drained from her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Daniel's face contorted with shock, disbelief, and anger all at once. "You're kidding," he said, his voice cracking. "She was with him behind our backs?" Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the envelopes, scanning the messages herself. Each document confirmed what I had just revealed. The silence stretched, thick with disbelief, until Sarah's trembling voice finally broke through. I didn't want anyone to get hurt," she whispered, the words barely audible. I let the silence hang before adding calmly, "The truth has a way of coming out, Sarah. You could hide it for months, even years, but the consequences don't disappear just because you wish them away. Everyone deserves to know when trust has been broken. And now, they do." My words were firm, but not cruel. The family needed clarity, and Sarah needed to face the reality of her actions. Her hands shook as she clutched the arms of her chair, the reality of exposure sinking in fully. The room erupted in a mixture of anger, disbelief, and whispered questions. Daniel's voice rose, sharp and accusatory. "How could you? All this time? And for what?" Evelyn stood, trying to mediate, though her eyes reflected the deep hurt she felt. Sarah tried to explain, her sentences breaking apart mid-thought, every excuse sounding feeble in the presence of the evidence I had laid bare. The family had been blindsided, and the shock was absolute. By the end of the hour, the consequences were undeniable. Sarah's secret was no longer hidden, the trust of the family shattered, and the fragile sense of normalcy destroyed. I sat quietly, observing the fallout, knowing that while pain would linger, truth had a way of creating space for healing. And in that moment, I realized that exposing the secret wasn't just about justice or revelation. It was about reclaiming honesty, boundaries, and the unspoken promise that no one's actions would go unchecked, no matter how carefully they were hidden. The room felt heavy with tension, each heartbeat echoing the weight of what had just been revealed. Sarah sat slumped in her chair, staring at the floor, while Daniel paced in silent fury, trying to process the betrayal. Evelyn hovered, torn between wanting to comfort and feeling the sting of disappointment. I remained seated, observing, letting the family absorb the reality that trust had been broken in a way that would take time to repair. Every glance, every sharp intake of breath, underscored the fragility of the moment. Daniel finally stopped pacing, his voice low but trembling. "I can't believe you kept this from all of us, Sarah. From me, from Mom. His hands shook, and I could hear the hurt behind his anger. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, a quiet gesture to soften the blow, though her eyes reflected the collective shock of the room. Sarah raised her head slightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was scared," she whispered. "Scared of losing everyone. I thought I could manage it alone, and I was wrong." My presence remained steady, my tone calm as I spoke. Secrets have a way of taking on a life of their own. The longer they're hidden, the harder it becomes to control the damage. But now that the truth is out, you have a choice. Either let it destroy the family, or face it together and try to rebuild. The words were measured, not accusatory, but they carried the weight of accountability. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the envelopes, as if confronting the evidence herself might offer some release. Evelyn stepped closer to her, voice soft, yet firm. "We want to understand, Sarah, not to punish, but you need to be honest, completely honest, if we're going to have any chance of healing." Sarah nodded slowly, swallowing hard as the first glimmer of courage returned. She began to explain the reasons for her secrecy, her fear of judgment, and her misguided attempt to protect everyone from perceived hurt. Every word she spoke peeled back layers of fear and shame, revealing a human being beneath the mistakes. Daniel listened, arms crossed, jaw tight, struggling with the storm of emotions inside him. "It still doesn't fix what you did," he said finally, "but I can see why you were scared." His voice softened, tinged with reluctant empathy. Evelyn exhaled slowly, relief and fatigue mingling in her expression. I watched as the first steps toward reconciliation, however fragile, began to take shape, like cracks in ice that might one day support solid ground again. Sarah's gaze shifted to me, Emily, a mix of gratitude and lingering fear evident in her eyes. "Thank you for not letting me hide it any longer," she whispered, barely audible. I nodded gently, understanding the delicate balance between accountability and compassion. The family had reached a point where honesty could exist alongside love, though it was tentative and fragile. Every eye in the room held a silent acknowledgement that the road ahead would be difficult, but at least it could now begin. By the end of the evening, the tension had not dissipated entirely, but it had transformed. What was once explosive anger became careful dialogue. What was once disbelief became cautious understanding. The fractures in the family remained, but there were small bridges beginning to form, constructed from honesty, courage, and the shared recognition that secrets could no longer govern their lives. And as I left that night, I felt a sense of hope, knowing that even broken families could find the first glimmers of repair when truth was allowed to breathe. The house was quiet that morning, heavy with the remnants of the previous night's revelations. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, head bowed, fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed, jaw tight, but visibly calmer than the night before. Evelyn moved between them like a gentle current, offering support where words failed. I, Emily, watched quietly, feeling the weight of everything that had passed, and the strange mixture of grief and relief that comes after truths are finally laid bare. "I don't know if I can ever undo the hurt I caused," Sarah said softly, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel finally spoke, his tone measured, heavy with reluctant forgiveness. "You can't, but you can try to do better. We can try, together." His words, though cautious, carried a sincerity that broke through some of her shame. Evelyn smiled faintly, a glimmer of hope in her eyes, and even I felt the tension in the room ease just slightly. It was the first sign that perhaps they could find a new rhythm, imperfect, fragile, but real. Sarah's lips trembled as she looked around the room. "I've hidden too much for too long," she admitted. "I thought secrecy could protect everyone, but it only made things worse. I want to try to make it right, if you'll let me." Daniel sighed, leaning down to meet her gaze. "It won't be easy," he said, voice quiet but firm. "It'll take time, trust, and honesty every day. But yes, I want to try." We all do. The room hummed with a fragile sense of reconciliation, a tension between lingering pain and the first threads of forgiveness. I spoke next, my voice calm but intentional, bridging the distance between them. "This doesn't erase the past, but it gives you all a choice moving forward. Secrets like these have power only as long as they remain hidden. Now that truth is out, you can start rebuilding, carefully, cautiously, but genuinely. That's the only way forward." My words seemed to settle over them like a soft blanket, offering both accountability and possibility. I felt the weight of my role in the revelation. Exposing Sarah had been necessary, but guiding them toward understanding was equally crucial. The family spent the rest of the morning talking, hesitating, and sometimes arguing quietly, but always returning to the core truth, honesty. They acknowledged the mistakes, the fear, the deception, and most importantly, the desire to heal. Sarah's hands trembled less as she spoke. Daniel's eyes softened as he listened, and Evelyn offered steady presence, creating a safe space for fragile reconciliation. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be instantaneous, but it was a beginning. By the afternoon, laughter, tentative, almost hesitant, began to seep into the house. Small jokes, shared memories, and gentle teasing replaced the tension that had dominated the previous night. Sarah glanced at me, gratitude shimmering in her eyes. "I never imagined it could feel like this," she murmured. "Like maybe we can be a family again." I smiled softly, feeling the truth in her words. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air, and sometimes it takes one person to make the storm visible so healing can begin. As I walked home later that day, the sun warm on my shoulders, I reflected on everything that had happened. Secrets had a way of defining us, but honesty, courage, and empathy had the power to redefine relationships. The family's foundation had been shaken, exposed, and tested, but it had also been strengthened by the clarity of truth. And in that quiet moment, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, that even in the face of deception, betrayal, and fear, people could choose to rebuild, to forgive, and to embrace the imperfect beauty of being human. Together, the house felt strangely quiet in the days after Easter lunch. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful exactly, but reflective, the aftermath of a storm, when everything has settled, yet the air still carries a faint tension. I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in my hands, staring out the window at the garden where daffodils had begun to bloom. The sunlight was soft, spilling over the yard, and I felt a strange sense of calm, almost surreal, after the chaos of that day. It was a calm I hadn't expected to feel, given how violently the events of the past weeks had shaken our family. Daniel came into the kitchen first, his expression still wary, but more relaxed than it had been immediately after the revelation. He carried a small tray with 2 mugs, placing mine gently in front of me. "Coffee?" he asked quietly. I smiled faintly, nodding. He lingered for a moment, hesitant, before taking a seat across from me. We didn't speak immediately. Words felt unnecessary. There was an unspoken understanding that something fundamental had shifted between us. Not everything was resolved, but something new had begun to take root. Sarah's presence was quieter these days. She moved through the house carefully, aware of the family's lingering skepticism, but determined to prove that she could be trusted. I noticed the small gestures, washing dishes without being asked, making a cup of tea for Evelyn, quietly listening before speaking. She was no longer the confident, manipulative woman who had dominated every family gathering. She had been humbled by exposure, forced into vulnerability, and it had changed her in ways I hadn't anticipated. Watching her, I realized that shame, when confronted honestly, could be transformative rather than destructive. Evelyn remained the family's anchor. She had taken it upon herself to facilitate small gatherings, moments when dialogue could happen without confrontation, when trust could be rebuilt in increments rather than all at once. She would sit with Sarah in the living room, discussing plans for the garden, or talk with Daniel about his work, always making sure the threads of communication were maintained. I admired her patience. She understood that healing wasn't linear, that reconciliation required both forgiveness and acknowledgement of past wounds. One evening, a week after the revelation, we sat down together for dinner. The air was lighter than it had been at Easter, though still tinged with caution. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly, a small gesture of solidarity. Daniel looked at her, hesitating, then offered a half smile. "I know we're not where we need to be yet," he said, "but I can feel us moving in the right direction." Sarah nodded, a soft look of relief on her face. For the first time, I felt that the family could survive the fracture, that we might even thrive despite it. The weeks that followed were a slow process of rebuilding trust. Sarah continued to prove herself through actions rather than words, each step forward reinforcing the fragile bonds between us. Daniel cautiously began to share more with her, and though there were moments of tension, the openness gradually replaced the tension with genuine understanding. I found myself reflecting often on my role in the events, how revealing the truth, though painful in the moment, had forced the family to confront the cracks we had long ignored. In exposing the secret, I hadn't just changed Sarah's path, I had changed all of us. I also noticed subtle changes in myself. The confidence I had gained from standing up for honesty and integrity at Easter lunch had seeped into other areas of my life. I spoke more openly at work. I set boundaries with friends who had overstepped. And I began to notice that living with transparency rather than concealment felt empowering. I realized that the courage to expose a truth, even one that was uncomfortable, even one that risked confrontation, had given me a new lens through which to view relationships and personal responsibility. Months passed, and the family continued to navigate the aftermath with care. There were no grand gestures, no sudden resolutions, only a gradual, deliberate effort to rebuild what had been fractured. Sarah had earned small but meaningful trust markers, asking for advice instead of hiding decisions, apologizing sincerely for past deceptions, and participating in family activities without her usual need for validation. Daniel, too, had softened, learning that while anger was justified, holding on to it indefinitely would only hinder healing. Evelyn remained steadfast, quietly guiding interactions with patience and wisdom, her influence as subtle as it was powerful. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the garden, watching the daffodils sway gently in the breeze. The memory of Easter lunch came unbidden, the shock, the revelation, the anger, and ultimately the moment of exposure that had changed everything. I realized that confrontation, when approached with courage and intention, could catalyze growth. Secrets, lies, and manipulations had a temporary hold over us, but truth had permanence. It was not painless, nor was it immediately gratifying, but it was necessary. In that realization, I felt a profound sense of closure, a deep respect for the resilience of my family. As I walked back into the house, Sarah and Daniel were laughing quietly in the living room, Evelyn knitting nearby, her eyes twinkling at some private joke. The energy in the house had shifted, no longer dominated by tension and suspicion, but marked by cautious hope and tentative warmth. I joined them, feeling a sense of belonging I had long doubted I would ever experience fully. That day, I understood something vital. Family is not defined by perfection, secrecy, or unbroken harmony. It is defined by the willingness to face flaws, confront truths, and choose understanding over resentment, time and time again. And as the evening settled into calm, I knew that while the Easter revelation had been painful and explosive, it had ultimately given us something far more enduring: clarity, accountability, and the knowledge that even amidst deception and betrayal, love could survive if we dared to face the truth together. It wasn't the end of our challenges, nor the erasure of past mistakes, but it was the beginning of a family redefined, stronger for the honesty that had finally been allowed to breathe.